Do you have any fives?
Go for it. This is dumb. Say, you've been taking that Islam class.
Yeah, I have.
What about Al Qaeda?
I would love to tell you about it if you're okay with that.
I'd love to hear it.
The story of Al Qaeda actually begins long before you'd think. I would say it actually begins with a man named Saeed Qutb. I can't say it, I'm not Muslim, obviously, I don't speak Arabic. But he was an Egyptian man who came to America in 1948. And he was really surprised by the debauchery and the sex and the materialism, which is kind of interesting because if you think of it, that was in 1948. You know, that was long before MTV. It was like the age of Marilyn Monroe, you know, that kind of beauty. So he came over, he spent 2 years in America, and he was just absolutely disgusted by what he saw. So once he went back to Egypt, he started writing basically these anti-Western books. He started really gaining a following that would agree with him about his views of America. This led him to meet up with and join the Muslim Brotherhood back in Egypt. And he had some key beliefs that really affected the beliefs and the mission of Al Qaeda and eventually Osama bin Laden. He really believed that the true believers needed to preach Islam. That was his one big goal. He also believed that they needed to destroy the institutions of society, those being corporations, government, and even the military in some cases. Once this would be accomplished, a utopian society would arise where the people would be so passionate and righteous that there would be no need for government. They also believed that democracy wasn't a valid form of government. This stems from his beliefs and his experiences in America. So this is kind of where the heart of the East versus West mentality begins. Yeah, now let's fast forward about 40 years to the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. This is during the height of the Cold War. So this is where the Americans and the Russians are at the height of their conflict. Al Qaeda isn't even a seed in the mind of the Americans at this point. So their complete goal was to make sure that the Soviets lost the Cold War. And the funny thing about it is actually, they were responsible for supplying what would become Al Qaeda with guns, arms, and money to help fight the Russians in Afghanistan. Ironically enough, once the Soviet Union fell, Al Qaeda would become basically their biggest opponent until, well, the early 2000s up until even today. The Americans' plan to eliminate the Soviet Union from Afghanistan worked in August of 1988, when the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan. This turned the attentions of the freedom fighters, which again included Osama bin Laden and many of the high members of Al Qaeda, to turn their attentions to more of a global jihad that would expand to the far reaches of the world, into more of what we see them as today. From that point, they moved on to doing all the things that we know them for today.
I'm a little confused on the concept of jihad itself.
Yeah, jihad itself is actually a lot of times easy to misinterpret, because there's actually two interpretations of jihad. Jihad is actually translated as striving, or striving to the way of God. Jihad is usually applied to warfare, like Al Qaeda. That's the most common one. But many Muslims also interpret it as striving against the individual's anti-ethical tendencies within themselves. So there's two main kinds of jihad. There's the military jihad that most Western people are very familiar with, and then there's jihad within yourself. So basically bettering yourself to make sure that these things aren't within you.
How does Al Qaeda justify their military jihad?
Osama bin Laden and the rest of Al Qaeda actually use hadith, the Quran, and Sunnah to justify their jihad. Actually, I just happen to have one hadith right here. Hadith number 8, entitled Fighting in the Defense of Islam, Al-Jihad. Jabir reported, the Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, said, I have been commanded to fight the people until they say there is no God but Allah, so that when there is no God but Allah, then their lives and wealth are protected from me, except by right of justice, and the reckoning is with Allah. It's interpretations with hadith and verses in the Quran like this that allows them to say that what they're doing is right.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do they justify killing innocent men and women and children, and even other Muslims?
I know, that one always kind of gets me too. But they actually argue that they're justified in killing men, women, and children, because when they pick a target, let's say the World Trade Centers. That is their target. They believe that they're justified in killing men, women, and children in legitimate targets where they cannot be distinguished from combatants. So they would argue that there was combatants in the World Trade Centers, that the World Trade Centers were a justified target, and that the men, women, and children that they killed were justified in the process of them destroying those buildings. As far as Muslims go, they believe that any Muslim that would ally themselves with the West or the United States, they are in the same boat and they are justified in being killed as well. But it's always a little bit murky because it's always open to interpretation to who is allying with who, as they can always interpret someone's actions as allying with the West so they can kill them. And as far as Americans go, all Americans are considered non-innocents because they are, it's funny because as a democracy, which Al Qaeda is completely against, the people of America choose their leaders and have a hand in politics. And that's the reason that they're justified in being killed, because they have a hand in choosing their leaders and choosing their politics. So that's how they justify killing all those innocent people.
So I'm curious, what has Al Qaeda been up to since the 90s?
They've actually been doing a lot of things. I'll give you kind of a brief overview of what they've been up to since the 90s till now. In 1991, bin Laden moves the base of Al Qaeda to Sudan, Africa, where he forges links with militants across the Middle East and North Africa who play roles in numerous military attacks. This includes a bombing on the World Trade Center in 1993, if you remember. In February of 1998, after being expelled from Sudan and returning to Afghanistan, he issues a fatwa against the United States, which is the basis for the attacks on the World Trade Centers later in 2001. In 2001, which is obviously their most well-known attack on the World Trade Centers, which then moved into the United States declaring the war on terror and invading Afghanistan. On May the 2nd in 2011, when US Navy SEALs stormed a nondescript compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and killed bin Laden. Obviously, you remember this one as well. Basically, the United States believed after this point that they had won, that they didn't have to worry about Al Qaeda anymore.
Obviously, the West disagrees with Al Qaeda, but what do Muslims think?
Actually, I just found this really great article that talks just about this subject. It was done actually by the Pew Research Center. Yeah, they actually surveyed 11 countries that contained Muslims. They surveyed Senegal, Lebanon, Tanzania, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Egypt, Palestine, Jordan, Indonesia, and Turkey. Out of all of these countries, 67% of them were concerned about extremists. So these are people that were at unease by all extremists, not even necessarily just Al Qaeda. Out of these countries, 50% of them were unfavorable of Al Qaeda, so they disagreed with what Al Qaeda is doing. Interestingly enough, Lebanon is the highest, where 96% of people disagree with what Al Qaeda is doing. And in Nigeria, the people that oppose Al Qaeda has actually raised from 2010 to 2013. It has jumped from 34% to 62%. So it's interesting to think that actually, as much as the West and a lot of people that we live with and we grow up with think that all Muslims are either terrorists or agree with the terrorists, they don't. This is, 67% of the Muslims in these countries are concerned about extremists, and 50% of them are unfavorable of Al Qaeda. And these are in countries that are very traditional Muslim. So it really undermines these stereotypes that we hold about them.
Wow. This information changes all the perceptions I had on Islam. It's pretty sad how synonymous terrorism and Islam have become in the West since 9/11. It's crazy to see that more than 50% of Muslim people show concern for extremists and do not support Al Qaeda. It's amazing how the context and background of a topic like Al Qaeda can change everything. Thanks, Jorden.
It was my pleasure, bro.
What a beautiful thought I am thinking concerning a great speckled bird. Remember, her name is recorded on the pages of God's holy word.